Now pull up a chair. Come closer. The world out there will keep spinning while I talk, I promise you that. Some stories don't rush. Some stories need the slow telling, the kind that settles in your bones the way wood smoke settles into an old wool blanket. This is one of those stories. I'm going to tell you about a man named Samuel Mitchell. And I'm going to tell you about a horse called Bella. And I'm going to tell you how the two of them, one old and worn down by the world, one brand new and barely holding onto it, somehow saved each other on the wind-scoured flatlands of West Texas. Pay attention, because this isn't just a story about a horse and a man. It's about what happens when one human being refuses to walk away from something fragile and already condemned. Those stories are rarer than they used to be. Hold on to this one. The morning sun over West Texas is something you either love or it breaks you. There's no in between. When it comes up near a place called Mercy Ridge, it doesn't creep up gentle like it does back east. It throws itself across the sky like a man who's been told he's not welcome and decides to come anyway. All orange and burning pink, filling everything from horizon to horizon, painting the land in colors that don't have proper names. Samuel Mitchell had watched that sunrise thousands of times. 15 years of mornings. 15 years of walking out the creaking door of his small worker's cabin, breathing in that first cold gulp of pre-dawn air, tasting the hay and earth and horse sweat on the wind, and feeling, just for those quiet minutes before the ranch woke up, like the whole world belonged to him alone. He was 53 years old that autumn. You could read his whole life on him if you knew how to look. His hands were rough in a way that only comes from decades of actual labor, not the fashionable roughness of men who lift weights in air conditioning, but the deep-grained, calloused, cracked-at-the-knuckles roughness that speaks of fence posts and frozen water buckets and every kind of hard outdoor work there is. His face was brown and weathered. His back had the faint forward curve of a man who had bent himself to the earth's work so long the earth had begun to slowly reclaim him. But his eyes, Lord, his eyes were something else. People at the ranch said Samuel didn't have a friendly face, and they weren't wrong exactly. He didn't smile easy, didn't laugh much, didn't sit around the bunkhouse after dinner telling jokes. He was quiet the way a deep well is quiet. Not empty. Just deep and still and not interested in performing for you. But those eyes, a rich warm brown, filled with a gentleness so steady it almost seemed like it came from somewhere else. Children noticed it. Dogs noticed it. Horses noticed it most of all. Samuel had never married. He had no children, no family within visiting distance. The ranch was his whole world, and within that world, the horses were his truest kin. He knew their individual sounds and smells and moods, which ones were proud and which ones were afraid, which ones had been hurt by people and needed a quieter kind of handling. He could walk into a barn full of restless horses and the whole barn would settle, just from the particular quality of his presence. That was the man who walked out into the early morning air on that autumn day, pulling his worn jacket tighter, and started down the south pasture fence line. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just walking the fence the way you walk it when a place is your responsibility, when you've given yourself over to it so completely that its well-being and your own are no longer separate. And then he saw the movement. Near the old wooden fence in the far corner, where the grass grew tallest, something small, something uncertain, something barely there. Samuel stopped walking. He stood perfectly still, the way he'd taught himself to stand around animals, and he knew what he was seeing inside 2 seconds. A foal. A newborn horse, just hours into its life, standing in the tall grass on legs so thin and trembling they looked like they'd been made by someone who had only ever heard a description of legs and never actually seen a set. He felt that flutter in his chest, the one that came every single time new life appeared on the ranch, without exception, without diminishing. That small private joy at the beginning of things. He moved toward the foal, slow and deliberate. And then he began to see what was wrong. She was too small. A newborn foal has a certain presence, a certain substance that says, "I am here, I intend to stay." This foal didn't have that. She looked like a drawing of a horse someone hadn't quite finished. Her legs were like sticks, not the regular thinness of a newborn, but something beyond that. A fragility that made his chest tighten. She was trembling all over, a constant full-body quiver, as though the simple effort of existing was taking everything she had. And her coat stopped him at 20 feet. White, a bright clean white across most of her body, and scattered over that white, dark brown spots of varying sizes. Around her face, one large spot covered her left eye and ear like a painted mask, giving her an asymmetrical, startling look. To most eyes, Samuel understood immediately, she looked wrong. Like a mistake that had been allowed to walk around. Then he looked for what he already knew he was going to find. The mother was there, 30 feet away, her back partially turned, head down, eating grass with the focused indifference of an animal that has made a decision and is done with the subject. She would not look at the fall. She would not approach it. Whatever instinct had told her this particular birth wasn't going to work had been strong enough to override whatever warmth she might otherwise have offered. Samuel had seen this before. It was not cruel, not in the way human cruelty is cruel. It was nature's accounting. Nature does not spend resources on what it has already calculated will fail. He understood it. He had always understood it. But understanding a thing and accepting it are two entirely different animals. He stood watching the foal shake in the early light, watching her turn her head to look for her mother and not find her, and something deep in his chest contracted, hard, like a fist closing. Because he already knew, standing there, exactly what Harold Thompson was going to say. He'd worked for the ranch owner for 11 of his 15 years at Mercy Ridge. Thompson was not a bad man, paid his workers on time, never cheated on an honest deal. But he was practical in the particular total way that leaves no room for the unlikely and the fragile. He ran his ranch like an equation that had to balance, and anything that didn't balance got removed. Samuel could hear Thompson's voice in his head as clearly as if the man were standing beside him. This fool will not survive. She will not be useful. I do not want to waste feed and water on something already dying. Samuel turned and walked back to the ranch, the flutter in his chest gone now, replaced by something heavier and quieter than he carried like a stone in a coat pocket. By noon, Thompson had gathered the hands near the barn. He stood with his hands on his hips, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. A foal born in the south pasture, he announced.
Too small.
All wrong coloring, white all over with spots like a sick animal. Mother already rejected it. Any man who comes across it should put it down. Clean and quick. It is a mercy, not a cruelty. This is how we survive out here. The men nodded. This was how things worked at Mercy Ridge. Samuel nodded too. Because that is what you do when you are a worker, and this is the owner, and that is how things work. He turned away and went back to the fence he'd been repairing near the eastern boundary. But his hands were shaking. Just the faint, almost invisible trembling of a man whose insides are in disagreement with what his outsides just agreed to. He gripped the fence post harder than necessary and waited for it to stop. It didn't stop. Not that afternoon, not while he ate his dinner alone in his cabin, not while the stars came out and the ranch went quiet, that enormous West Texas quiet that exists only far from roads and towns. He sat by the window and looked at the dark shape of the south pasture and thought about a small white spotted foal trembling alone in the tall grass, and he thought about the verdict handed down that afternoon, and he thought about what kind of man he was. He thought about that for a long time. And then he got up. Now let me tell you something about courage, because you need to understand what Samuel did next and why. Real courage, not the movie kind, not the kind where a man makes a speech in front of a crowd and everyone cheers, is much quieter and lonelier than that. The real kind happens in the dark, When no one is watching, when you're not sure it will work, when you know it might cost you something you cannot afford to lose. It happens when a worn-out man gets up from his chair because he cannot sit there anymore and pretend he doesn't know what's happening a quarter mile away in the south pasture. Samuel gathered things quietly. A clean bottle, fresh milk from the kitchen, a handful of hay. He moved through the dark ranch like a man who knows a place with his whole body, past thinking, past needing light to guide him. The stars were out in numbers beyond counting, and the air was cold, and he walked the fence line until he reached the far corner, and there she was, still on her feet. He hadn't been sure she would be, but she was standing, barely, swaying on those impossible legs, her white coat faintly luminous in the starlight, those brown spots like shadows across her body. Samuel dropped down slowly to one knee in the grass, the way you do when you want to make yourself smaller, less threatening, more like something that belongs on the ground. He extended one hand, palm open and turned up. And he waited. The world held its breath. And then the fall took one small trembling step toward him. And then another. And she lowered her nose to his palm. The warmth of that small nose against his rough hand. The tiny exhalation of breath across his skin. Samuel stayed very still and let her take him in, his smell, his warmth, the particular quality of his stillness. He fed her from the bottle, slow and patient, supporting her with his other hand when her legs wobbled, talking in a voice so low it was almost below sound, a murmur, a reassurance, a presence. She drank. Slowly at first, then with urgency as her body recognized what it needed. He sat in the cold grass under all those Texas stars and fed a condemned full, and he didn't think about his job or the risk or the sensible reasons this was probably foolish. He thought about how warm her small body was against his arm. He thought about how she had walked toward him when she didn't have to. He named her Bella that night, there in the dark. Didn't say it out loud. He wasn't a man who talked to himself. But he thought it clearly and deliberately, the way you think something when you've decided it's true. Bella. Not because she looked beautiful by the world's regular definitions, but because he could see something in her that the world's regular definitions didn't account for. Something already there, already her, already alive and fighting in those dark, intelligent eyes. In the days that followed, Samuel built Bella a secret world. He had learned every forgotten corner of Mercy Ridge in 15 years, and that knowledge became their shelter, quite literally. On the far south edge of the property, hidden behind a low rocky ridge nobody had reason to cross, there was an old hay storage shed, abandoned and half-collapsed, invisible to anyone who didn't already know it was there. He worked on it with his own hands, his own tools, his own money, in every spare hour outside his regular duties. He rebuilt the walls, patched the roof, packed the floor deep with hay and straw. He created a warm corner just the right size for a small foal to curl into on cold nights. He did all of this in the margins of his life, in the space between when the last worker left and when the first one arrived. Every morning before first light, he was at the shed with fresh milk and hay and clean water carried in 2 buckets across the pasture. Every evening after the last hand drove away, he was back. He would sit in the hay and Bella would come to him, and they would spend an hour or two in the lamplight, Samuel talking low, Bella listening with those dark eyes that seemed to contain more understanding than any horse he had ever known. He talked to her about everything. That surprised him. He was not a man who talked. But with Bella the words came, slow and unpracticed at first, then more freely. He told her about the ranch in spring when the wildflowers came up. He told her about a dog he'd had as a boy who followed him everywhere and died too young. He told her about his mother, her hands, the warmth of her presence in a room, and about how 11 years old is too young to lose your mother, and that at 53 he still hadn't fully figured out how to fill the space she'd left. He told her about his father, the harsh economy of that man's love, always rationed, always just out of reach. He spoke about it without self-pity. But he spoke about it, which was more than he'd done with any human being in 30 years. And Bella would listen. She would turn her ears toward the sound of his voice. She would rest her chin on his knee or lean her nose against his shoulder. Sometimes she closed her eyes while he was talking, not from boredom but from something that looked like the deep, peaceful relaxation of a creature that feels completely safe. Weeks passed, and Bella grew. By mid-October, she was a different animal from the trembling thing he'd found in the grass. Her legs had thickened into something solid and purposeful. The constant shivering had stopped. Her coat had come into its own, the white bright and deep simultaneously, the brown spots rich and warm, the large one over her left eye that had once made her look wrong now the first thing anyone mentioned when they tried to describe her. She was beautiful, and Samuel had known she would be, but the knowing and the seeing are different things, and the seeing still moved him. But the physical changes were not the most remarkable thing. The most remarkable thing was her mind. Samuel had worked with smart horses before, but Bella was something he didn't have a neat category for. She learned the feeding whistle in 2 days. She learned the difference between that whistle and the one that meant come walk with me within a week. She learned the sound of his footsteps and could distinguish them from any other, responding immediately when she heard him approach and not stirring for anyone else. She learned the subtle changes in his posture that preceded different activities, the way he leaned forward when he was about to groom her, the way he sat down lower when he intended to stay and talk. She didn't just learn these things. She acted on them before they fully happened. Before Samuel had shifted his weight toward the grooming position, Bella was already arranging herself to make it easier. It was as if she could read something in him below the level of conscious signal, something he wasn't even aware he was sending. One afternoon he decided to test it. He stood up and began a jog around the outside of the shed, just a gentle lope, the kind of movement a horse makes when playing. He glanced back at Bella. She watched him for a moment, and then she began to run after him. They ran in circles together, her legs moving with perfect coordination, her body strong and graceful. When Samuel finally stopped, breathing heavily, Bella came to stand beside him, and he laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine, starting somewhere deep. He had not laughed like that in years. The sound startled them both. Bella's ears went up, and then she bounced. A little four-legged bounce, nose going briefly in the air, like a happy dog. As if she was laughing too. "All right," he said, when he could talk. "You keep your secrets." But with each passing week, the weight of hiding grew heavier. Samuel worked double, performing perfect reliability in his regular duties so no one would look too closely at where he spent his margins. He was always the first to the water troughs and the last away from the evening feed. He saved money from his small salary, redirecting every spare dollar toward haying grain and supplies. And the practical problem was becoming urgent. Winter was coming, and the shed that had been adequate through autumn was not going to hold against a real Texas storm. He had improved the walls and packed the floor, but he knew its limits. One evening Marcus, a young hand with the particular alertness of someone still figuring out what matters, came walking toward the shed from the direction of the ranch. Samuel stepped outside, trying to look casual. "What are you doing all the way out here?" Marcus called. "It's getting dark." "Assessing this old structure for Thompson," Samuel said, keeping his voice steady. "Seeing if it could be used for storage." Marcus looked at the shed, looked at Samuel, shrugged, and walked away. Samuel waited until the young man was completely out of sight before he let out the breath he'd been holding. Too close. He sat with Bella that night and made a clear-eyed promise to himself. Whatever came next, whatever it cost, he would face it for her. The warning came in the afternoon, the sky turning a strange green-gray, the light changing quality in a way that made your skin feel strange, the wind shifting into something with a voice and a purpose. Samuel was near the eastern barn when he felt it, and he stood with his tools in his hands and looked at the horizon, and his stomach dropped clean through to his boots. He had watched West Texas weather for 15 years. This was not a regular storm. He finished his work as fast as he could, said nothing to anyone, and when the last hand had driven, Wayne and Thompson had retreated to the ranch house, he moved. He gathered blankets and extra hay, tucked everything under his coat, and walked toward the south pasture at something close to Iran. The temperature was dropping fast. He could see his own breath. The wind was already pushing him sideways. When he reached the shed, he found Bella at the entrance watching for him, ears flat back, eyes wide. He worked quickly, thick hay across the floor, double deep, blankets around Bella's body, canvas tacked over the weakest wall gaps. He did everything he could think of. And then the storm hit, and he knew immediately it was not going to be enough. The wind came first, not just strong but violent, hitting the shed walls like something with intention. The temperature dropped again. Rain turned to sleet, turned to snow. Ice rattled against the roof. Cold air poured through gaps he hadn't found. The walls flexed and groaned. The lamp flickered. Samuel looked at Bella and saw real fear in her eyes. He knew, in the clear, simple way that real decisions arrive, that if he did not get her out of this shed and into proper shelter tonight, she might not survive it. He wrapped his best blanket around her. He lifted her. His back registered the ask immediately, the full protest of a 53-year-old body being asked something unreasonable. But he found the weight, got her settled against his chest, and stepped out into the storm. The cold took his breath like a fist. The wind nearly knocked him down. Snow drove into his face. The world had disappeared into white in every direction. Samuel had no landmarks, no guides, nothing but 15 years of knowing this land in his bones, where every stone set, every fence post stood, every dip and rise in the ground ran. He began walking toward the ranch, and the storm fought him with every step. He talked to Bella while he walked. Low and steady, the same voice he always used. Telling her it was okay, telling her he had her, that this was going to be all right. She stayed still against his chest. He felt her breathing, warm and steady. She trusted him, in the middle of the worst thing he had walked into in 15 Texas winters. She trusted him completely, and that trust was what kept him moving when his arms went numb and his legs were burning and his lungs ached from the cold. It took nearly an hour to reach the barn. When he finally stumbled through the doors, covered in snow and ice, his face frozen, his hands nearly blue, he stood in the dark interior for a full minute just breathing, letting his body understand that they had made it. He carried Bella to the stall he had quietly prepared weeks before, just in case, he had told himself, knowing it would come to this, and laid her down in the clean straw and began rubbing her down, working the cold from her coat, making sure she was warm and dry and safe. He was so focused on her that he didn't hear the footsteps. He didn't see the lantern light until it was already filling the stall doorway. Harold Thompson stood there holding a lantern above his head, staring at Samuel and Bella with an expression of complete shock. His eyes moved from Samuel to the spotted fool, then back to Samuel again. "What in God's name?" Thompson said slowly. Quiet. Controlled. Filled with something. Samuel straightened. He met his employer's eyes. He had nothing to say and was too tired to invent anything. He simply stood there and waited for what was coming. Thompson stepped into the stall. He held the lantern out toward Bella, who was lying in the straw looking up at him with calm, curious eyes. And Samuel watched Thompson's expression change. The hard lines around the man's mouth softened. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, began to show something else. Something like understanding. Something like regret. He stood there in silence, studying the beautiful white horse with the brown spots, studying the way Bella leaned towards Samuel's touch, studying the bond between man and animal that was so visible and so undeniable that no one could mistake it for anything other than what it was. "You saved her," Thompson said finally, barely above a whisper. "All these weeks. You carried her through that storm tonight." He was not asking. He was seeing something he had not seen before, the power of loyalty, the meaning of love, the transformation that happens when someone believes in a creature the whole world has written off. Samuel nodded. He prepared himself to be fired. Thompson was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, rougher, quieter, coming from somewhere that didn't get used often. "I was wrong," he said. "About the fall. And about other things." He paused. "She's yours. You'll keep her. You'll care for her the way you have been. And from now on, you don't have to hide." He turned and walked out of the barn, taking the lantern with him, leaving Samuel in the dark with Bella and with the sound of the storm dying down outside, as if it too had been waiting for that particular thing to happen before it agreed to ease. Samuel sat down in the straw beside Bella. She moved her head into his lap. He put his hand on her neck and felt her heartbeat, steady and strong, and he sat there for a long time in the quiet dark. Spring came to West Texas suddenly, overnight, the way it always does, as if the land had been holding its breath and finally let it go all at once. The bluebonnets came up across the south pasture. The sky went from winter gray to a blue so deep you could lose yourself in it. And Bella came into spring like she'd invented it. She was not a fool anymore. She had grown through the winter into something that made people stop walking when they first saw her. She moved with that rare quality horsemen spend lifetimes looking for, the combination of power and lightness, strength and ease, intelligence and grace that speaks of an animal perfectly at home in its own nature. Her white coat was luminous in sunlight, the brown spots rich and warm, the large one over her left eye that had once made her look wrong now the first thing anyone mentioned when trying to describe her. Word spread the way word spreads in ranching country, slowly at first, then all at once. Neighboring ranchers came to see her. People talked. Thompson bragged, and every time he told the story he made sure Samuel Mitchell was at the center of it. He told it the way a man tells a story he's a little embarrassed to be part of, which meant he told it honestly. "I told them to put her down," he would say, flat out. "I was wrong. Samuel saw something I couldn't see, and he paid a price I wouldn't have been willing to pay." The other hands treated Samuel differently. Not dramatically, he was still quiet, still preferred Bella's company to most human company. But the younger men stopped and asked him questions, and he answered carefully, and they listened the way people listen when they know they're being taught something they can't get from a book. Bella herself became something people couldn't quite explain. There was a girl, 7 years old, visiting the ranch one Saturday, who was terrified of horses. Not ordinary nervousness, but something deeper, something a bad early experience had installed in her. Her uncle led her toward the pasture fence without thinking. The girl went completely still. Bella was at the far end of the pasture. She looked up, and Samuel, watching from nearby, saw the moment Bella registered the child. The way her whole attention shifted, focused, became specific. She began walking toward the fence, slowly, smaller somehow, her neck lower, her movement contained and deliberate, broadcasting at every step, "I am not alarming. I am curious about you. I mean to show you something." She walked to the fence and stood a few feet from the girl and waited. Didn't toss her head. Didn't shift. Just stood, breathing, looking at her with what Samuel could only call a kind expression, though he knew that wasn't supposed to be a thing horses had. After a long minute, the girl's hand came slowly up toward the fence. Slowly, until her fingers were a few inches from Bella's nose. Bella stretched her neck, very gently, and touched her nose to the girl's fingers. The child let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for years. An hour later, she was standing beside Bella in the pasture with her hand flat on Bella's neck, talking to her the way children talk to things they've decided to love, completely and without reserve, as if they've always known each other. Samuel watched from a distance and said nothing. But he felt that flutter in his chest again. That small private joy at the beginning of things. And then there was the wild stallion, the day in summer that people across the region would talk about for years. A full-grown stallion had escaped from a neighboring ranch through a fence break nobody noticed until it was too late. It came across Mercy Ridge at a dead run, frightened and furious, a powerful body in the full grip of panic. The hands scattered, which was right insensible. Bella walked toward it. Samuel saw her go and his heart rose into his throat. He started running before he'd consciously decided to run. But something quieter and more certain in him made him slow. Made him stop. Made him watch. She walked toward the charging stallion with no drama and no hesitation. Airs forward, soft, not the pricked alertness of challenge, but something more open than that. Neck level, movement unhurried. She walked like a creature that has decided everything is going to be okay and is prepared to let the world know. The stallion's pace slowed. Not much at first. Then more. He was still trembling, still showing the whites of his eyes, still carrying all that terror in every line of his body. But something Bella was broadcasting, some frequency below the range of human instruments, some language older than language, was reaching him. She stopped 10 feet from him. They stood looking at each other. What passed between them in the next few minutes, Samuel could not have described to anyone's satisfaction. But it was real, and it was alive, and it worked. The stallion's trembling eased, degree by degree. His neck came down. His feet slowed. Bella did not move. She simply remained what she was, present, calm, certain, and offered that certainty to the panicked animal until he was able to take it. When the stallion's people arrived, following his trail from the broken fence, they found him standing quietly beside a spotted mare in the south pasture of Mercy Ridge Ranch, and both horses were perfectly calm. The story of that day traveled further than any of the others. People who heard it would say, "Tell me again how that horse came to be there." And the story would go back to the beginning, back to a cold autumn morning, a fall in the tall grass, and a quiet man kneeling in the dark with his hand held out. Years passed. Samuel's hair went gray, then white. His back bent a little more. His hands became the hands of an old man, mapped with a lifetime's labor, beautiful in the way that honestly used things are beautiful. He kept working. Nobody at Mercy Ridge ever suggested he stop. His presence had become something they couldn't imagine the ranch being without. And every evening, without exception, he went to Bella. She was not young anymore either. But she moved with a settled, deep authority, the quality of a creature that knows what it is and has always known. She had been a mother. Her faults had inherited her quiet intelligence and gentle nature, and people had come from some distance to acquire them, and each one had become its own story worth telling. On those evenings when Samuel sat with Bella in the barn, they were quiet together the way people who have known each other a long time are quiet, not because there's nothing to say, but because so much has already been said, and the saying is no longer necessary for the understanding. Sometimes he would talk. He told her once about the first morning, the flutter in his chest when he'd seen her in the grass, the way the mother was turned away. He told her about the night of the storm, the weight for against his chest, his numb hands, the decision to keep walking. He told her about standing in the barn afterward with Thompson's lantern, waiting for the anger that never came. "You saved me," he told her one quiet evening. Simply, without drama. "I know the story says I saved you." And that's true. But it went the other direction too. I was disappearing before you. Very slowly, very quietly. The way men disappear who have no one to be for. I was still here in all the physical ways, but some other part of me had already started going. And then there you were. He put his hand on her neck. She leaned into it, as she always had. We saved each other. And everything that came after, that little girl's healed fear, that stallion, the fools, all of it, that came after because we chose each other. Because I refused to walk away, and you walked toward me when you didn't have to. He sat with her until the stars came out. The same stars that had been above in the first night, kneeling in the cold grass with his hand held out. He looked up at them through the barn window and felt the specific peace of a man who has used his life well. Now, you're wondering why an old man is telling you all this. Why this particular story, tonight, with such care for the details. We live in a world that is very efficient at identifying what isn't worth keeping. What is too small, too fragile, too strange looking, too unlikely to contribute anything useful. What the practical eye looks at and says, this will not survive, this is not worth my time. And sometimes, that practical eye is right. I know that. I'm not asking you to be a fool. But Samuel Mitchell knelt in the cold grass in the dark and held his hand out to something the whole world had already condemned. He had no plan, no guarantee, nothing except a refusal to let the verdict stand without at least trying. And out of that refusal, out of that one patient, private, costly act of faith, came Bella. And out of Bella came a healed little girl and a cowboy sheltered on the ground, in a wild stallion comb, and Foal's carrying her nature forward into the future, in this story you're hearing right now, which has already outlasted everyone who first lived it. You see how these things go? The world will always have Harold Thompsons in it. Practical men with practical calculations and the authority to hand down verdicts. The world needs them. Somebody has to run the ranch. I'm not saying otherwise. But the world also needs Samuel Mitchells. Needs them badly and often doesn't know it until the moment has already passed. Needs the quiet ones who look at what everyone has written off and see something different in its eyes. Needs the ones willing to carry something fragile through a storm, alone in the dark, with nobody watching and no guarantee of a good outcome. The question, carry it home with you. Think about it at 2 in the morning when the real questions make themselves known, is which one you're going to be. Not in some grand public moment where the right thing is clearly marked and people are watching. Those are easy. Those don't test you. I mean the quiet moment. The south pasture in the dark. The full trembling in the tall grass. The world's verdict already handed down. What do you do? Samuel Mitchell knelt down. He opened his hand. He waited. That's the whole story. The rest, the growth, the beauty, the transformed lives, the rest is just what happens when you kneel down and open your hand and wait long enough. Go on, now. It's late. Take that with you. And some evening, when you've got someone sitting close who needs to hear it, you tell it slow and right and pass it on. That's how these things survive. That's how they last.